Widow with Triplets was auctioned for her husband's debt, until a silent rancher stood up. The autumn wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls of Sarah Mitchell's modest cabin, carrying with it the promise of another brutal Colorado winter. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she ladled thin soup into 3 cracked bowls, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the fear that had been gnawing at her for weeks. "Mama, I'm still hungry," whispered 7-year-old Emma, her pale face reflecting the flickering candlelight. Beside her, the twins, 5-year-old Ben and Beth, watched their mother with the wide, knowing eyes of children who had learned too early that the world was not kind. "I know, sweetheart," Sarah said, forcing a smile as she set the meager portions before them. "This is all we have tonight, but tomorrow." She let the words trail off, unable to voice the lie that tomorrow would somehow be better. It had been 8 months since tuberculosis claimed her husband Thomas, leaving behind not just a grieving family, but debts that seemed to multiply like weeds in spring rain. Thomas had been a good man, but weak when it came to cards and whiskey, a combination that had proven fatal to more than just his health. Sarah had sold everything of value, her mother's china, Thomas's tools, even her wedding ring. She'd taken in washing and mending, worked her fingers raw scrubbing floors for the wealthy families in town, but it was never enough. The creditors circled like vultures, and she knew her time was running out. The sharp rap on her door made her freeze, the ladle clattering into the pot. She met her children's frightened eyes and pressed a finger to her lips before moving quietly to the window. Through the frost-covered glass, she could make out 3 figures on horseback, their forms silhouetted against the setting sun. "Mrs. Mitchell." The voice was harsh, impatient. "Open this door. We know you're in there." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized the voice of Edgar Whitman, one of the most ruthless creditors in Copper Ridge. Behind him would be his associates, men who viewed human suffering as merely the cost of doing business. "Children, go to the back room," she whispered urgently. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear." Emma grabbed her siblings' hands and pulled them toward the small bedroom, their bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. Sarah waited until she heard the soft click of the door closing before approaching her own door with leaden steps. "Mrs. Mitchell, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Whitman called again. "You've had months to settle your husband's debts. Time's up." With shaking hands, Sarah lifted the wooden bar that secured her door and pulled it open. Whitman stood on her threshold, a thin man with calculating eyes and a mouth that seemed incapable of kindness. Behind him were 2 other men she recognized from town, Bill Crawford, who owned the general store, and Pete Hawkins, a local rancher with a reputation for cruelty. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, lifting her chin despite the terror coursing through her veins, "I told you I needed more time. I'm expecting payment from Mrs. Henderson for the quilts I've been making." "Enough," Whitman interrupted, pushing past her into the cabin. His eyes swept over the sparse furnishings, the nearly empty shelves, the cold fireplace. "There's nothing here worth taking. Nothing that would even begin to cover what's owed." Crawford stepped forward, his bulk filling the doorway. "Thomas owed us nearly $300, Sarah. You know as well as we do that you'll never earn that kind of money doing piecework." Sarah's stomach dropped. $300 might as well have been $3,000. In a frontier town where a man was lucky to earn $50 a month, it was an impossible sum for a widow with 3 children. "There has to be another way," she pleaded. "I'll work harder, take on more jobs. I'll pay you back, I swear it." Whitman's laugh was devoid of humor. "With what? Look around, woman. You're barely keeping body and soul together as it is." He paused, his gaze lingering on her face with an expression that made her skin crawl. "But there is another option." Sarah took an instinctive step backward. "What do you mean?" "The territorial law is clear," Crawford said, pulling a worn document from his coat pocket. "When a debtor dies leaving insufficient assets, the family can be held responsible for settlement of debts through alternative arrangements." "Alternative arrangements?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Whitman smiled, but it was the smile of a snake preparing to strike. "Auction, Mrs. Mitchell. You'll be auctioned to the highest bidder. Whoever wins gets your service until the debt is paid, plus interest. It's all perfectly legal." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers of such things happening in other territories, but had never imagined. "My children," she gasped. "What about my children?" "They'll be provided for," Hawkins spoke for the first time, his voice gruff, but not entirely without sympathy. The winner of the auction takes responsibility for the whole family. It's not ideal, but it's better than the alternative. Sarah's mind reeled. The alternative. She knew what that meant. Debtor's prison for her and the children sent to an orphanage, scattered to the winds, never to see each other again. "How long do I have?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Auction set for Saturday," Whitman replied. "That gives you 3 days to get your affairs in order." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Sarah? Don't get any ideas about running, we'll be watching." The 3 men filed out into the gathering darkness, leaving Sarah standing alone in her cabin, the weight of her impossible situation crushing down upon her. From the back room came the soft sound of Emma comforting the twins, her young voice singing a lullaby their mother had sung to her. Sarah sank into the single wooden chair by her table, her head in her hands. In 3 days, she would stand before the people of Copper Ridge like livestock, her future and her children's future decided by whoever was willing to pay the most for their services. The candle flickered in the draft from the poorly fitted door, casting dancing shadows on the walls of what had been her home, but would soon be just a memory. Outside, the wind continued to howl, carrying with it the bitter promise of winter and the faint sounds of life from the town below, a town where she would soon discover whether any mercy remained in the harsh frontier world of the American West. Saturday morning dawned gray and bitter, with frost covering the wooden sidewalks of Copper Ridge like a shroud. Sarah stood before the cracked mirror in her bedroom, her hands trembling as she pinned her dark hair into a simple bun. She had chosen her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had once been her Sunday finest, knowing that appearances might make the difference between a tolerable arrangement and something far worse. The children sat on the edge of the bed, dressed in their cleanest clothes, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Emma had stopped asking questions after Sarah's fumbling attempts to explain what was happening, but the 7-year-old's eyes held a wisdom no child should possess. "Will we stay together, Mama?" Ben whispered, clutching his sister Beth's hand. Sarah knelt before her children, fighting back tears she couldn't afford to shed. "I don't know, darling, but whatever happens, remember that I love you more than all the stars in the sky. And remember that your papa loved you too, even though he made mistakes." A heavy knock echoed through the cabin. Sarah's stomach lurched, but she stood and smoothed her skirts. It's time. The walk to the town square felt like a death march. Word had spread quickly through Copper Ridge, and curious faces peered from behind curtains and shop windows. Some showed pity, others judgment, and a few displayed the hungry look of men who saw opportunity in desperation. The auction block, normally used for livestock and farm equipment, had been set up in front of the courthouse. A small crowd had gathered, perhaps 40 people in total, though Sarah noticed several women had turned away or gone inside when they saw her approaching. Edgar Whitman stood beside the block, official papers in his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the square, "we're here today to settle the debts of the late Thomas Mitchell, as provided for under territorial law. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell and her 3 children will be bound to the winning bidder until the debt of $300 plus accumulated interest, now totaling $350, is fully satisfied." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The debt had grown even larger. Beside her, Emma gripped her hand tighter. "The terms are clear," Whitman continued. "The winning bidder assumes responsibility for housing, feeding, and caring for the family. Mrs. Mitchell will provide domestic services, and the children will contribute according to their abilities. The arrangement continues until the debt is paid or 7 years have passed, whichever comes first." 7 years. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining her children grown and scattered, their childhood sacrificed to their father's mistakes. "Do we have any opening bids?" Whitman called out. An uncomfortable silence stretched across the square. $350 was more money than most people in Copper Ridge saw in 2 years. Finally, a voice called out from the back of the crowd. $50. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the voice of Jake Morrison, a homesteader with a reputation for drinking and violence. His own wife had died under suspicious circumstances the previous winter. $50, Whitman repeated. "Do I hear 60? 75, came another voice. This from Bill Crawford, who owned the general store. Sarah knew his wife was sickly, and she shuddered at the thought of the workload that would await her in his household. 100, Morrison countered, his voice slurred even at this early hour. The bidding continued, creeping upward in painful increments. Sarah forced herself to remain standing, though her legs felt like water. She could feel the stares of the crowd, some sympathetic, others calculating. Her children pressed close to her sides, their small bodies trembling. 175, called out a new voice. Pete Hawkins, the rancher who had come to her cabin with Whitman. He was a hard man who worked his ranch hands like mules, but at least he had money and wouldn't starve them. 200. Morrison shot back, weaving slightly as he stepped forward. Sarah caught the gleam in his eyes and felt sick. The bidding slowed as the price climbed beyond what most could afford. At $225, it seemed to stall between Morrison and Hawkins, with Crawford having dropped out with obvious relief. Sarah found herself hoping desperately that Hawkins would win, despite his harsh reputation. At least his ranch was prosperous, and she'd heard he treated his animals well, which was more than could be said for Morrison. 225 going once, Whitman called out, his gavel raised. 250, Hawkins bid, his jaw set with determination. Morrison's face darkened. 275, he snarled, though Sarah could see him calculating the money in his head, likely coming up short. 275 going once, Whitman announced. Sarah held her breath. The sum was still far short of what was owed, but territorial law allowed for partial satisfaction if no higher bids emerged. The remainder would become her burden to work off through extended service. Going twice. $400. The voice came from the edge of the square, quiet but carrying clearly in the crisp air. Every head turned toward the sound. Sarah saw a tall figure step out from behind a wagon, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. The crowd murmured in surprise. $400 was more than the total debt, unheard of at such auctions. The man stepped closer and Sarah got her first clear look at him. He was perhaps 40 years old, with weathered features that spoke of years under the frontier sun. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Most striking were his eyes, a deep gray that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. "Did you say 400, mister?" Whitman asked, clearly flustered by this unexpected development. "Stone, Jacob Stone." The man's voice was low, steady. "And yes, $400. Morrison stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. "Now wait just a minute. Who are you to come in here and—" "The law says highest bidder wins," Jacob Stone replied calmly, not even looking at Morrison. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "I have the money, cash in hand." Sarah stared at this stranger who had just purchased her family's future. She had never seen him before, which was unusual in a town the size of Copper Ridge. Everything about him suggested he was a man of means. His horse was well-fed and well-groomed. His saddle was quality leather, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 400 going once, Whitman called out, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. This wasn't how these auctions typically went. No other bids came. The crowd had fallen silent, everyone sensing that something significant was happening, though none could say exactly what. "Going twice," Whitman continued. Jacob Stone reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch, the clink of gold coins audible in the stillness. "Sold," Whitman announced with obvious relief, "to Mr. Jacob Stone for $400. As Stone approached the auction block to complete the transaction, Sarah felt the world shift around her. In the space of a few minutes, her life and her children's lives had been forever altered by a man she had never met, whose motives remained completely mysterious. The only thing she knew for certain was that her family now belonged to Jacob Stone, and she had no idea whether that would prove to be their salvation or their doom. The transaction took place in near silence, the scratch of pen on paper the only sound as Jacob Stone signed the necessary documents. Sarah watched his hands, calloused but steady, the hands of a man who worked hard but wasn't desperate. When Whitman counted out the gold coins, Stone's expression never changed, as if $400 meant nothing to him. "The arrangement is now legally binding," Whitman announced, though his voice lacked its earlier authority. He seemed as unsettled by Stone's intervention as everyone else. "Mrs. Mitchell and her children are now under your care, Mr. Stone." Stone nodded once, then turned to face Sarah and her children for the first time since winning the auction. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the small scar along his jaw. His gaze moved from her face to the children, lingering on each of them with what might have been gentleness. "Gather your things," he said quietly. "We leave within the hour." "Leave?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Where are we going?" "My ranch, about 15 miles north of here." His tone was matter-of-fact, giving away nothing about what awaited them there. "Pack light. Whatever doesn't fit in one bag stays behind." As they walked back to the cabin, the children silent beside her, Sarah's mind raced with questions. Who was Jacob Stone? Why had he paid so much? More than the debt required. What did he expect from them? The stories she'd heard about such arrangements ranged from families treated as little more than slaves to others who found themselves in situations barely distinguishable from adoption. At the cabin, Sarah moved mechanically through the rooms, selecting the few possessions that mattered most. The children's clothes, a photograph of Thomas, her mother's Bible, and a small wooden horse that had belonged to the twins' grandfather. Everything else, the furniture Thomas had built, the quilts she'd sewn, the dishes they'd eaten from, would remain behind, markers of a life that no longer existed. Emma helped pack the twins' things, her small hands efficient and careful. "Mama," she whispered when the boys weren't listening. "Is he going to hurt us?" Sarah knelt beside her daughter, taking the small face in her hands. "I don't know what's going to happen, sweetheart, but I promise you this. As long as I'm breathing, I'll do everything in my power to keep you and the boys safe." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah opened it to find Jacob Stone standing on the threshold, his hat in his hands. Behind him, she could see a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 well-fed horses. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah nodded, lifting the single carpet bag that held their remaining possessions. Stone's eyes moved to the children, who huddled close to their mother like frightened animals. "The ride will take about 3 hours, he said, his voice gentler than before. "There are blankets in the wagon, and I brought some food for the journey." As they settled into the wagon bed, Sarah was surprised by its cleanliness and the thick blankets Stone had provided. The food he mentioned turned out to be fresh bread, cheese, and even some dried apples, more than her children had seen in weeks. Stone himself climbed onto the driver's bench without another word, and they began the journey into an uncertain future. The road north led through increasingly wild country, past abandoned homesteads and through valleys where only cattle and wild horses moved. Stone drove with the easy competence of someone who knew every rock and rut in the road. Occasionally he would point out landmarks to the children, a distinctive rock formation, an eagle's nest, a creek where deer came to drink, but mostly he remained silent. As the miles passed, Sarah found herself studying the man who had bought her family. His shoulders were broad beneath his coat, his hands sure on the reins. When they stopped to rest the horses, she watched him check the animals with careful attention, running his hands along their legs, adjusting their harnesses. Everything about him spoke of competence and quiet strength. It was nearly sunset when they crested a hill and Sarah got her first glimpse of Stone's ranch. The main house was larger than she had expected. Not a mansion, but substantial, built of logs and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was already there preparing for their arrival. Outbuildings dotted the property. A barn, a smokehouse, what appeared to be a bunkhouse, and several smaller structures she couldn't identify in the fading light. Cattle grazed in the distance, more than she could easily count. This was no struggling homestead. Jacob Stone was clearly a man of considerable means. "It's not much," Stone said, speaking for the first time in over an hour, "but it's warm and dry." As they pulled up to the house, a woman emerged onto the porch. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back severely, and a face that looked as though it rarely smiled. Her dress was plain but well made, and she carried herself with the authority of someone used to running a household. "This is Mrs. Clara Hendricks," Stone said as he helped Sarah and the children down from the wagon. "She manages the house and will show you where everything is." Mrs. Hendricks studied the new arrivals with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Supper's ready," she announced. "I expect you're hungry after the journey." Inside, the house was simply but comfortably furnished. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books. more books than Sarah had ever seen in a private home. The main room flowed into a kitchen where the smells of roasted meat and fresh bread made her stomach clench with hunger. "Children will sleep in the small room off the kitchen," Mrs. Hendricks said briskly. "Mrs. Mitchell, you'll have the room at the top of the stairs. Supper's in 10 minutes, time to wash up." As they sat down to eat, the children's eyes wide at the abundance of food on the table, Sarah finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind all day. "Mr. Stone," she began carefully, "I need to understand what's expected of us here. What are our duties?" Stone looked up from his plate, his gray eyes meeting hers directly. For a long moment he said nothing, and Sarah wondered if she had overstepped somehow. "You'll help Mrs. Hendricks with the house," he said finally. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry, the usual domestic work. The children will attend school in town once we get them enrolled. Beyond that," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Beyond that, you'll be treated as members of this household, not as servants or prisoners." "And the debt?" Sarah pressed, needing to understand the terms of their arrangement. "Consider it paid," Stone replied quietly. Sarah stared at him in shock. "But the law states that I purchased the right to your service until the debt was satisfied," Stone interrupted. "I've decided the debt is satisfied. You're free to leave any time you choose, though you're welcome to stay as long as you need to get back on your feet." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma looked between her mother and Stone with wide eyes, while the twins continued eating, too young to fully understand the conversation, but sensing its importance. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "Why would you do this? You don't even know us." For the first time since she'd met him, something flickered across Jacob Stone's features. Pain, perhaps, or regret. He looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred from years of ranch work. "Let's just say I know what it's like to lose everything," he said quietly. "And I know what it's like when someone offers you a second chance." As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself more confused than ever. Nothing about this situation made sense. Men didn't spend fortunes at auctions out of simple kindness, especially not in the harsh realities of frontier life. Jacob Stone was hiding something. She was certain of it. The question was whether his secret would prove to be her family's salvation or their destruction. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and promising another cold night. But for the first time in months, Sarah's children would go to sleep with full bellies and warm beds, and for now that was enough. 3 weeks passed like a dream Sarah feared to wake from. The children had grown rosy-cheeked and bright-eyed, their laughter echoing through the house as they adapted to their new life with the resilience only children possessed. Emma had thrown herself into helping Mrs. Hendricks with enthusiasm, while the twins spent their days exploring the ranch under the watchful eye of Miguel, Stone's foreman. Sarah herself had found an unexpected peace in the rhythm of domestic work. The house was well appointed and comfortable to maintain, and Mrs. Hendricks, despite her stern exterior, had proven to be a patient teacher and increasingly a friend. But it was Jacob Stone himself who remained an enigma. He was unfailingly polite but distant, rising before dawn to work the ranch and often returning after the children had gone to bed. When their paths did cross, he treated her with a courtesy that bordered on reverence, as if she were a guest rather than someone whose family he had purchased at auction. The contradiction gnawed at her. It was on a crisp November evening, as Sarah sat mending one of Ben's shirts by the fireplace, that everything changed. Stone had returned early from his rounds and sat across from her, apparently content to read in companionable silence. The children were asleep, and Mrs. Hendricks had retired to her quarters. "Sarah," he said suddenly, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. She looked up, surprised by his use of her first name. "Yes?" He set down his book, a volume of poetry she'd noticed him reading before, and met her eyes. In the firelight, his face looked younger, more vulnerable. "There's something I need to tell you about why I bid on your family that day." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "My wife, Elizabeth. She died 2 years ago in childbirth. We'd been trying for children for nearly 15 years. Sarah's hands stilled on her mending. She had wondered about the feminine touches in the house, the delicate curtains, the china displayed in the kitchen, the garden that someone had clearly tended with love. "The baby died too," Stone continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A little girl. Elizabeth had already picked out the name. Grace. He stared into the fire, lost in memory. I couldn't save them. I had all this land, all this money, and I couldn't save the two people who mattered most. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I can't imagine. When I saw you standing there with your children, facing the same kind of desperation I'd felt watching Elizabeth slip away. He shook his head. I couldn't let someone else's family be destroyed when I had the power to prevent it. The silence stretched between them, filled with understanding. Sarah realized that Jacob Stone hadn't rescued her family out of charity or expectation of service. He'd rescued them because saving them helped heal something broken inside himself. The debt really is forgiven, he said, looking at her directly. You're free to leave whenever you choose, but I hope you'll consider staying, not as servants, but as... He struggled for the word. As family. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of the past weeks, of her children's laughter, of the safety and warmth they'd found here. She thought of Jacob Stone's quiet kindness, his gentle way with the twins, the respect he showed her. I'd like that, she said softly. We'd all like that very much. Something shifted in Stone's expression. A wall coming down, a door opening. For the first time since she'd met him, he smiled, and the transformation was remarkable. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the ranch in pristine white. But inside the warm house, two wounded souls had found something neither had dared hope for. A second chance at happiness, built on foundations of mutual understanding and shared loss. 6 months later, on a spring morning bright with promise, Sarah Mitchell became Sarah Stone in a simple ceremony, attended by their children, Mrs. Hendricks, and half the town of Copper Ridge. As they exchanged vows, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought them together, how what had seemed like her family's darkest hour had actually been the beginning of their salvation. The debt that had once threatened to destroy them had instead led them to a love neither had expected but both desperately needed. In the harsh frontier world of 1880s Colorado, where survival often meant sacrifice, Sarah and Jacob had discovered that sometimes the greatest risks yield the most extraordinary rewards. Their story became legend in Copper Ridge, the widow who was auctioned for debt and the mysterious rancher whose single bid changed 4 lives forever. But for Sarah, the real miracle wasn't in being rescued. It was in discovering that broken hearts, when they heal together, can become stronger than they ever were alone. As she watched her children play in the meadow behind their home, Emma teaching the twins to braid wildflowers while Jacob worked nearby, Sarah knew that some debts could never truly be measured in gold. The debt of gratitude, of love, of second chances. These were currencies that enriched rather than impoverished, and she would spend the rest of her life grateful for the day a quiet rancher had stood up and changed their world. What did you think of Sarah and Jacob's incredible journey from desperation to hope? This story shows us that sometimes our darkest moments can lead to our greatest blessings, and that true love often comes from the most unexpected places. If this tale of courage, redemption, and second chances in the American frontier touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts about how Sarah's strength and Jacob's compassion created something beautiful from tragedy. Don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this emotional story, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of resilience and love from America's past. Your support helps us bring these powerful human stories to life.